He tracked her through a blizzard, ready to make his runaway bride pay in blood. But when Lorenzo Bianchi finally pinned a trembling Amelia against a frozen brick wall, tearing her coat in a fit of blind rage, the jagged, brutal brand burned into her flesh, brought the ruthless kingpin to his knees. The scent of $1 million worth of white orchids was supposed to be the fragrance of Lorenzo Bianchi's ultimate triumph. Instead, it became the stench of his greatest humiliation. 2 weeks ago, inside the grandiose, vaulted ceilings of Holy Name Cathedral in downtown Chicago, the undisputed head of the Bianchi syndicate had stood at the altar in a custom Tom Ford tuxedo, waiting for a woman who would never walk down the aisle. Amelia Carmichael, the quiet, unassuming daughter of a mid-level logistics manager in his organization, had vanished. She had left behind a meticulously tailored Vera Wang gown, hanging like a ghost in the bridal suite, a 3-carat flawless diamond engagement ring resting on the vanity, and a reputation-shattering scandal that rippled through the darkest underbellies of the city. In Lorenzo's world, a world dictated by blood oaths, territorial control, and violent retribution, respect was the only currency that mattered. Amelia's disappearance was not merely a broken heart. It was a declaration of war against his pride. Whispers had immediately ignited among the capos and rival families. The great Lorenzo Bianchi couldn't even control a fragile girl from the suburbs. The humiliation burned hotter than a gunshot wound. For 14 agonizing days, Lorenzo did not sleep. He transformed from a calculating businessman into a relentless, obsessed bloodhound. He refused to let his enforcers handle the hunt. This was personal. He tore through her father's house, interrogated her closest confidants, and utilized a sprawling network of underground surveillance to track a ghost. Amelia had been clever. She had abandoned all electronics, paid for everything in cash, and used a series of burner identities to weave her way across state lines. But no one, not even a desperate bride, could outrun the reach of the Bianchi family forever. A slip-up at a tiny, off-the-grid pharmacy in the snow-draped mountains of Crested Butte, Colorado, was all it took. She had purchased antibiotics under the name Clara Davies, but the face captured on the grainy security footage was unmistakably hers. Now, the unforgiving Colorado wind howled through the narrow, desolate alleys of the mountain town. The temperature had plummeted below zero, and a fresh blizzard was rapidly burying the streets in heavy, blinding powder. Lorenzo stepped out of his black SUV, his long wool overcoat whipping around his calves. The crunch of his leather boots against the frozen pavement sounded like breaking bones. He gripped the handle of the custom 1911 pistol holstered beneath his jacket, though he knew he wouldn't need it. He spotted her a block away, exiting a dimly lit diner with a paper bag clutched to her chest. She was bundled in a cheap, oversized olive green parka, her head down, fighting the gale. Even buried under layers of thrift store clothing, Lorenzo recognized the delicate slope of her shoulders and the panicked, hurried rhythm of her steps. "Amelia," he whispered to the wind, a dark, lethal satisfaction pooling in his chest. He moved like a shadow, cutting through a parallel alleyway to intercept her path. As she rounded the corner of a boarded-up sporting goods store, Lorenzo stepped out from the darkness, blocking her only avenue of escape. Amelia halted so violently, she nearly slipped on the ice. The paper bag slipped from her numb fingers, spilling a lukewarm coffee and a wrapped sandwich onto the snow. For a suspended second, neither of them moved. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long, menacing shadows across the snowdrifts. Lorenzo stepped forward, his jaw clenched so tightly, a muscle feathered violently in his cheek. He had played out this moment 1,000 times in his head. He had planned to drag her back to Chicago by her hair, to parade her in front of the family she had disgraced, to lock her away in his Lake Forest estate until she learned the true cost of making a fool out of Lorenzo Bianchi. Did you really think? Lorenzo's voice was a low, guttural snarl that cut through the howling wind. That you could just walk away from me, from the family, from the oath you took. Amelia took a trembling step backward, her back hitting the freezing brick wall of the alley. Her breath plumed in the freezing air in rapid, terrified gasps. She looked up at him, her wide, hollow eyes devoid of the vibrant warmth he remembered. She looked starved, haunted. "Lorenzo, please," she rasped, her voice cracking, completely devoid of defense. "You don't understand. You have to stay away from me." "Stay away from you?" He closed the distance in 2 massive strides, his imposing frame trapping her against the bricks. He slammed his gloved hands against the wall on either side of her head. "You belong to me, Amelia. You made a mockery of my name. You humiliated me in front of the entire commission." "I had to," she cried out, turning her face away from him, squeezing her eyes shut as if expecting a physical blow. "If I stayed, if I married you—" "Lies," he roared, his legendary temper snapping the last threads of his restraint. Blinded by a toxic mixture of betrayal and raw adrenaline, he reached out and grabbed the collar of her heavy parka to haul her away from the wall. He pulled too hard. The cheap fabric of her coat gave way with a loud rip. The force of his pull tore the zipper down, and as she twisted violently to escape his grasp, her oversized wool sweater snagged on the jagged edge of a broken brick protruding from the wall. The heavy knit fabric ripped sharply, exposing her left shoulder and the upper curve of her back to the freezing night air. Lorenzo opened his mouth to deliver a vicious threat, but the words died instantly in his throat. All the air evaporated from his lungs. The furious, burning rage that had sustained him for 2 weeks vanished, replaced by an icy, paralyzing horror. There, marring the pale, flawless skin he had once sworn to cherish, was a massive, grotesque scar. The brand was monstrous. It wasn't the clean, accidental slice of a surgical knife or the random jagged tear of an accident. It was deliberate, calculated. The flesh on Amelia's shoulder blade was violently puckered, raised and discolored into a furious, angry red. The burn marks were fresh, perhaps no more than a few weeks old, the exact timeline of her disappearance. But it was the shape of the mutilation that made Lorenzo's blood run colder than the Colorado blizzard. It was a crest, a serpent tightly coiled around a bleeding dagger, the undisputed emblem of the Moretti crime syndicate. Lorenzo froze, his gloved hands hovering uselessly in the air. The Morettis were his most vicious rivals, a bloodthirsty faction operating out of New York, who had been trying to dethrone the Bianchis for a decade. Victor Moretti, their sadistic underboss, was infamous for his medieval methods of psychological warfare. "Amelia," Lorenzo whispered, his voice stripped of all its menacing authority. The mob boss who controlled governors and police chiefs was suddenly reduced to a horrified, trembling man. "Who did this to you?" Amelia whimpered, desperately trying to pull the torn edges of her sweater and coat back together. She was shaking uncontrollably, her teeth chattering from a combination of the sub-zero temperature and sheer, unadulterated terror. "Don't look at it," she sobbed, pressing her back flush against the frozen brick to hide the mark. "Please, Enzo, don't look at it." Enzo, the childhood nickname she had used in their most private moments. It pierced straight through the armor he had built around his heart. He didn't ask her again. He didn't demand explanations in the snow. Moving with sudden, terrifying gentleness, Lorenzo unbuttoned his heavy, cashmere-lined overcoat and slipped it off his shoulders. He wrapped it securely around her trembling frame, cocooning her in his warmth and scent. Without a word, he scooped her up into his arms, ignoring her weak protests, and carried her through the blizzard back to his idling SUV. Once inside the heavily armored vehicle, with the heat blasting and the tinted windows isolating them from the world, Lorenzo locked the doors. He poured a measure of bourbon from a crystal decanter in the console and pressed the glass to her frozen lips. She drank, coughing violently as the alcohol burned its way down her throat. Lorenzo gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning stark white. He stared straight ahead at the swirling snow, illuminated by the headlights. The silence between them was thick, suffocating, and heavy with the weight of unspoken atrocities. "The night of the rehearsal dinner," Amelia finally whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the SUV's heater. "You left early to handle a shipment at the docks." Lorenzo closed his eyes. The memory hit him like a physical blow. He had left her alone at the estate with his security detail. He had thought she was completely safe. "I went to the gardens to get some air," she continued, a tear slipping down her pale cheek, catching the dim interior lights. "Your men, they were already dead, Enzo. Before I could even scream, someone grabbed me. They dragged me into the maintenance shed." Lorenzo's chest heaved. He remembered finding the 2 guards dead the next morning, but the scene had been scrubbed clean. His lieutenants had convinced him it was a random hit, unrelated to Amelia's sudden disappearance the following day. He had been so blinded by the fact that she had packed a bag and left a note saying she didn't love him. He hadn't seen the truth right in front of his eyes. "It was Victor," Amelia choked out, wrapping her arms tightly around herself beneath Lorenzo's coat. "Victor Moretti. He brought a blowtorch and an iron brand. He tied me to a chair." A low, animalistic sound ripped from Lorenzo's throat. It was a sound born of pure agony and lethal, unbounded violence. "He told me," Amelia cried, her composure completely shattering, "that if I walked down that aisle, he would blow up Holy Name Cathedral. He showed me the blueprints. He showed me pictures of the explosive charges they had already planted near the organ. He said he would let the doors lock, and he would burn you, your mother, your little sister, and every capo in your family alive." Lorenzo turned his head slowly to look at her. The full crushing weight of his ignorance crashed down upon him. She hadn't run away from him. She hadn't betrayed him. She had sacrificed herself to save his entire bloodline. "He burned me," she whispered, her eyes dark and hollow. "He held the iron to my skin and told me I was marked, that if I ever tried to contact you, if I ever tried to warn you, he would send his men to butcher you in your sleep, and he made my father watch." Lorenzo's heart stopped. "Your father? My father sold the security codes to Victor," she wept, burying her face in her hands. "He traded my life and your family's lives to clear his gambling debts with the Morettis. He told me what to write in that letter. He packed my bags. Victor told me to run and never look back." The silence in the SUV returned, but this time it was electric. It was the silence before a catastrophic explosion. Lorenzo Bianchi, the man who had spent the last 2 weeks plotting ways to destroy the woman he loved, now understood that the true enemy was sitting right in his own boardroom. Her father, Victor Moretti. They had defiled his bride, tortured the woman he loved, and manipulated him into a blind rage. Lorenzo reached across the console. He didn't grab her roughly. He gently pried her trembling hands away from her face, interlacing his large, warm fingers with her freezing ones. He brought her knuckles to his lips and pressed a slow, reverent kiss against her skin. "Amelia," Lorenzo said softly, though his dark eyes were completely dead, swirling with a promise of apocalyptic retribution. "They thought they could break you to break me, but they made a fatal mistake." "What mistake?" she whispered, staring into the face of the monster she loved. "They left you alive." Lorenzo pulled out his encrypted satellite phone and dialed a number he reserved only for total war. "And now, Victor Moretti is going to learn exactly why they call me the Devil of Chicago." The sleek silver fuselage of Lorenzo's private Gulfstream G65-0 sliced through the violent winter storm, ascending above the heavy Colorado clouds into the dead of night. Inside the heavily pressurized cabin, the opulent atmosphere was a stark contrast to the brutal reality of what had just transpired in the frozen alleyway. Lorenzo sat in a plush leather armchair, his jaw set like carved granite, his dark eyes fixed unblinking on the bed in the rear of the cabin. Amelia lay there, sedated and wrapped in heated cashmere blankets. Dr. Sullivan, the syndicate's most trusted trauma surgeon, a man who had extracted bullets from Lorenzo's own ribs without asking a single question, was carefully applying a soothing burn salve to the grotesque serpentine brand. The heavy scent of antiseptic mingled uncomfortably with the faint, lingering metallic tang of blood in the pressurized air. "The tissue damage is extensive, Lorenzo," Dr. Sullivan murmured, his hands moving with precise, sterile efficiency. He did not look up, knowing better than to meet the boss's eyes when the devil was pacing behind them. "The iron was held against her skin for far too long. It will scar permanently. I can recommend a plastic surgeon in Geneva once she heals, perhaps a skin graft." "No." Lorenzo's voice was barely a whisper, yet it carried the terrifying weight of an executioner's gavel. "We do not erase it. The scar remains. It is a testament to her survival, and a reminder of my failure." Dr. Sullivan nodded once, packing away his medical instruments into a black leather bag. "She needs rest. The psychological trauma is just as deep as the physical burn. When you land at O'Hare, keep her isolated." Lorenzo didn't need to be told. The moment the jet's wheels kissed the tarmac in Chicago, Amelia was quietly transferred into a heavily armored SUV and driven directly to Lorenzo's fortress, a sprawling, triplex penthouse at the top of the St. Regis Chicago. The building was a modern marvel of glass and steel, heavily fortified, with an elevator that required dual biometric scans to access his floor. Once inside, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the icy expanse of Lake Michigan, Lorenzo finally allowed himself to breathe. He sat by her bedside until the first gray rays of dawn pierced the skyline, holding her fragile hand against his cheek. But the morning light did not bring peace. It brought the hour of reckoning. Leaving Amelia under the guard of his two most lethal enforcers, Dominic and Matteo, Lorenzo descended into the city. He did not go to his corporate boardroom. He went to a desolate, soundproofed meat-packing warehouse in the Fulton Market District, a relic from the old days of the Chicago mob, used only when blood was meant to be spilled off the books. Thomas Carmichael, Amelia's father, arrived at the warehouse at exactly 9 in the morning, escorted by 4 of Lorenzo's men. Thomas was a slender, balding man who wore expensive Italian suits that always looked a size too big for his cowardly frame. He walked into the freezing warehouse, rubbing his hands together, his eyes darting nervously toward the meat hooks hanging from the rusted steel tracks above. "Lorenzo, my boy." Thomas forced a trembling, grieving Mitt, stepping into the dim light of a single, swinging bulb. Your men said you had news. Tell me you found that ungrateful girl. Tell me you found Amelia. I swear to you, when she is brought back, I will discipline her myself for disrespecting our family." Lorenzo stood in the shadows, smoking a thick Cuban cigar. The cherry glowed violently in the darkness, the only indicator of the pure, unfiltered rage boiling beneath his tailored black suit. He stepped forward slowly, the heavy thud of his shoes echoing off the concrete floor. "You would discipline her, Thomas?" Lorenzo asked, his voice smooth as silk, yet laced with venom. He took a slow drag of his cigar. "A father's love. It is a beautiful thing to witness. A man should always protect his daughter." Thomas swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead despite the freezing temperature of the warehouse. "I raised her better, Lorenzo. I don't know what possessed her to run on the eve of the wedding. It broke my heart." "Did it?" Lorenzo closed the distance between them. He reached out, his hand moving so fast, Thomas flinched, expecting a strike. Instead, Lorenzo gently straightened the lapel of Thomas's expensive coat. "I had a very interesting conversation with my bride last night, Thomas, in a blizzard in Colorado." The color completely drained from Thomas's face. His knees buckled slightly, his breathing turning into shallow, panicked gasps. You found her." "Lorenzo, whatever she told you, she's confused. The girl is hysterical. She told me about the blueprints to Holy Name Cathedral," Lorenzo interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, echoing like thunder. "She told me about the explosive charges hidden near the organ. And she told me about the brand." Thomas fell to his knees. The facade shattered instantly. "Lorenzo, please. Victor Moretti had me by the throat. I owed him $2 million from the underground casinos in Macau. He threatened to kill me. I had to give him the security codes to the estate. I had no choice." "A man always has a choice," Lorenzo whispered, crouching down to look Thomas directly in his weeping eyes. "You could have come to me. I would have paid your debts. But you didn't just sell the codes, did you, Thomas? My men intercepted Victor's financial ledgers this morning. You didn't just wipe your debt. You accepted a 10% stake in the Chicago logistics routes. You sold my life, and you let a butcher burn your own daughter's flesh for a promotion." "I thought he was just going to scare her," Thomas sobbed, grasping desperately at Lorenzo's pant leg. "I didn't know he brought an iron. I swear to God." Lorenzo stood up, his face devoid of all human emotion. He looked down at the pathetic creature sobbing at his feet, the man who had handed his innocent bride over to a monster. "God cannot hear you in this room, Thomas," Lorenzo said coldly. He turned his back and began to walk toward the heavy steel exit doors. "Matteo!" From the shadows, the towering enforcer stepped forward, unholstering a suppressed Glock 19. "Don't shoot him," Lorenzo commanded without looking back. "A bullet is far too quick for a traitor who burns his own blood. Hang him from the chains. Let the cold take him, just like she froze in the snow." The agonizing screams of Thomas Carmichael echoed through the warehouse, but Lorenzo was already gone. He had cleansed his own house. Now it was time to burn down Victor Moretti's empire. New York City was entirely unaware that a ghost had crossed its borders. 3 days after the execution in the Chicago warehouse, Lorenzo Bianchi sat in the back of a blacked-out armored Cadillac Escalade, parked silently on a wooded bluff overlooking a sprawling, heavily fortified compound in the Hamptons. Victor Moretti's fortress. The Atlantic Ocean crashed violently against the cliffs below, mirroring the storm of vengeance brewing in Lorenzo's heart. He hadn't come with an army. An army was loud, An army meant negotiations and sit-downs with the 5 families. Lorenzo wasn't here to negotiate territory. He was here to carve a pound of flesh. He had brought only his 10 most lethal operators, men who moved like phantoms, dressed in tactical black, armed with suppressed weaponry and custom-forged combat knives. "Security grid is down, boss," Dominic crackled over the secure earpiece. The localized EMP wiped their cameras and the perimeter alarms. We have a 4-minute window before their backup generators kick in. "Execute," Lorenzo commanded coldly. He racked the slide of his own weapon and stepped out into the freezing coastal wind. They descended upon the Moretti compound like a biblical plague. The outer guards were neutralized before they could even draw a breath, dragged silently into the manicured hedges. Lorenzo didn't blink as he stepped over the bodies. His mind was laser-focused on one singular image, the grotesque serpentine brand burned into Amelia's pale skin. They breached the main doors of the mansion. Inside, Victor Moretti was hosting a high-stakes poker game in a lavish parlor adorned with baccarat crystal chandeliers and priceless Persian rugs. The heavy mahogany doors burst open, splintering off their hinges. Before Victor's bodyguards could even reach for their holsters, a synchronized symphony of suppressed gunfire erupted. Thwip, thwip, thwip. The sound was quiet, deadly, and absolute. Within 3 seconds, 6 of Victor's top lieutenants collapsed onto the velvet furniture, their blood staining the antique carpets a deep, horrifying crimson. Only Victor remained untouched, frozen in his leather armchair, a cigar dropping from his trembling lips. Lorenzo stepped into the room, the smoke from his gun barrel drifting lazily toward the crystal chandelier. He looked like the Grim Reaper wrapped in a bespoke Tom Ford suit. "Lorenzo," Victor stammered, raising his hands, his arrogant bravado vanishing in the face of certain death. Wait. We can talk about this. The Commission will have your head for coming into my territory. We can make a deal. I'll give you the ports in Jersey. All of them." Lorenzo casually walked over to the grand fireplace, crackling behind Victor's chair. He didn't speak. He picked up a heavy wrought-iron fire poker that was resting directly in the roaring flames. The tip of the iron was glowing a brilliant white-hot orange. Victor's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror as he recognized the poetic justice about to unfold. He tried to scramble out of his chair, but Dominic and Matteo were instantly there, slamming his shoulders down, pinning the squirming New York boss forcefully into the leather cushions. "You brought a blowtorch and an iron to a church, Victor," Lorenzo said, his voice terrifyingly calm as he stepped toward the captive man. He raised the glowing iron, feeling the intense heat radiating against his own cheek. "You laid your hands on my bride. You marked what is mine." "Lorenzo, please! It was business! It was just business!" Victor screamed, thrashing wildly against the unyielding grip of the enforcers. "To you it was business," Lorenzo whispered, leaning in so close that Victor could see the absolute lack of mercy in his pitch-black eyes. "To me it was a declaration of war, and a Bianchi never leaves a debt unpaid." Lorenzo didn't hesitate. He drove the glowing iron poker squarely into the center of Victor Moretti's chest. The agonizing, guttural scream that ripped from Victor's throat shook the very foundation of the mansion. The sickening smell of burning flesh and scorching silk filled the lavish parlor. Lorenzo held it there, his face completely impassive, watching the life drain from his greatest enemy's eyes, until Victor finally slumped forward, dead. Lorenzo dropped the cooling iron onto the bloody rug. He adjusted his cuffs, turned his back on the carnage, and walked out into the ocean breeze. The debt was settled. The ghosts were put to rest. 1 week later, the bells of a small private stone chapel on the outskirts of Lake Forest chimed softly in the winter air. There were no flashing cameras, no rival capos, no million-dollar orchid arrangements. The pews were empty, save for Dominic, Matteo, and Dr. Sullivan. Lorenzo stood at the altar, waiting. And this time, she did not run. Amelia walked down the short aisle. She wasn't wearing a sprawling Vera Wang gown. She wore a simple, elegant ivory slip dress that clung to her curves. But it was the design of the dress that made Lorenzo's breath catch in his throat. The back of the gown plunged drastically low, purposefully exposing her left shoulder. The scar was there. Raw, raised, and vicious. The Moretti serpent wrapped around the dagger. But Amelia stood tall, her shoulders back, holding his gaze with a fierce, unbreakable strength. She was no longer a victim hiding in a blizzard. She was a queen, wearing her battle wound with pride. As she reached the altar, Lorenzo didn't reach for her hand. Instead, he stepped around her. In front of God and the few men he trusted, Lorenzo bowed his head and pressed a gentle, lingering kiss directly onto the jagged, ruined flesh of her scar. Amelia exhaled a shaky breath, a tear of pure joy slipping down her cheek as he wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. "You are my life, Amelia," Lorenzo vowed, his voice thick with raw emotion, sealing their unbreakable bond. "For this world and the next." She smiled, resting her head against his racing heart. The devil had burned the world down for her, and from the ashes they had finally found their heaven. Amelia's horrific scar was meant to destroy Lorenzo, but instead it became the ultimate symbol of a love stronger than any mafia war. True loyalty means walking through the fire for the one you love. What did you think of Lorenzo's brutal, poetic revenge against Victor Moretti? Drop a comment below and let us know. If you enjoyed this heart-stopping mafia romance, please hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more thrilling stories.